Hi, I'm Rob,
And I'm Lily.
and welcome back to Hazel's Flight School. This episode is going to be all about Chardonnay. Chardonnay, Lily, as you now know, is probably the most easily recognized white wine grape on the planet and also easily the least understood. What we're going to be doing today is exploring the spectrum of Chardonnay, and we've got three that we're going to be tasting. We've got an unoaked stainless steel Chardonnay. We've got a used oak, somewhere in the middle style of Chardonnay with just a little bit of oak to it. And then we've got a full throttle, big oak, big malolactic, buttery style of Chardonnay. And we're going to compare and contrast these three styles, get a sense of that spectrum of Chard. Any questions before we get started?
Well, I am interested to know, is Chardonnay grown in only one location, or can you grow Chardonnay anywhere?
Oh my gosh. Chardonnay is grown pretty much everywhere you go in the world where wine grapes are grown. And it's actually a bit of a chameleon. It can adapt itself to so many environments and so many climates and soil types and so on. And because of that, it can come off quite differently depending on where it's grown. And we're going to see a little bit of that today. So I think we should just dive right in here. Now, for the record, as usual, and we talked about this in our first episode, we're not going to probably talk too much about what you actually smell in terms of fruit. Apple, pear, peach, what have you. And again, that's because Chardonnay, depending on where it's grown and how it's grown, can be all over the map on those things. So we're not going to focus on that so much. What we're going to focus on is the more general styles of Chardonnay and how they're made in this big, broad spectrum. So we're going to start with the Chardonnay that has not been manipulated very much. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's taste. I like it already, personally. What do you think?
Very clean, very fresh. Definitely a zesty, limey aftertaste that really stays on the palate.
Nice. Yeah, I'm right there with you. What's your guess on how this has been made? How this has been done?
Picked young. Not a lot of skin contact. Stainless steel.
Very good. Yes.
Not a lot of wood or stone containers used.
Exactly right. All stainless steel. I would not necessarily say that the fruit might be picked young, but you're getting that zesty, vibrant sense of the fruit, and that's really what these unoaked, especially stainless steel Chardonnays are all about, is just getting this nice, clean, pure expression of the fruit. And that citrusy element definitely coming through, however. I also get a nice kind of very crisp acidity and minerality. It's almost just a little bit chalky, especially on the finish. Don't know if you're getting that, and of course not everybody gets that.
Yeah, chalky's a good word.
All right. Anything else? What do you think overall? Do you like it?
I do like it. I don't think if I blind tasted it, I would know it was a Chardonnay, because I usually associate Chardonnay with a buttery, richer flavor than I would this.
All right. So let's move now to the second Chardonnay. We'll see how it goes. So what do you think?
It seems to me to be a more mellowed version of the first one. Comparatively, I'm still getting the same zest, the same lime notes, but there isn't as much of a minerally element to the wine. It flows more smoothly over the tongue, and it doesn't linger on the palate for quite as long.
All right.
This wine, if blind tasting, I would be harder pressed to place it or have a less confident guess in what it was compared to the first guess, which would be incorrect. But it would be harder for me to guess because it does have a little bit of that buttery, oaky elements that I would expect in a Chardonnay, but it's not quite as apparent.
Just a little bit of that. Yeah, right. So that slightly softer, slightly rounder texture that we get in a wine like this is the Jardin Macon Village, by the way. This is a white Burgundy. And you're getting a really good example of what happens with these white Burgundies, where this wine has seen some oak now. The first one, definitely all stainless steel. So there's oak, but I notice you're not really talking about the oak that much, right? You're not really getting those sort of oak aromatics, and we're going to definitely be talking about that in a minute. And that's because they're using used oak here. And the idea is that that oak does tend to soften the edges. The oak is a little bit porous. It lets a little bit of air get into the wine as it's fermenting, as it's aging, and that definitely softens and rounds off and takes the edges off the wine a little bit.
And for this one, I noticed you said white burgundy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clarify what you mean by saying white burgundy, because it is a Chardonnay? Are they the same thing?
I would say by and large, yes. Chardonnay is by far the dominant white grape in Burgundy, but it's not actually the only one. But when we think of white Burgundy, when we talk about white Burgundy, chances are almost 100% we're actually talking about Chardonnay here.
Okay.
So in this case, the Macon is an area of Burgundy that's a bit on the southern side of Burgundy, if you will. And in that case, these wines, they do tend to be just a little fatter, just a little rounder. It's a little warmer there. And you picked up on that. Very
And
good.
So the Burgundy is a regional distinction.
That is absolutely right. Yep, Burgundy is a region in France. And in that area, Chardonnay, again, the dominant white grape, but not actually the only one. Outstanding. All right, let's move to the third one. Pretty big contrast, I'm guessing. What do you
Yep.
think?
Huge contrast. Classic Chardonnay. This is exactly what I would expect.
So this is exactly what so many people think of when they think of Chardonnay. Big and fat and round. And what about oak?
Definitely oak. You're seeing those, you're tasting and smelling those elements. I think, especially when I was smelling this, that was these first two and this third, there was such a difference between the smell. You're losing some of the lime and the zest, and everything's becoming more mellow, and it really does just make me think of butter. And I know it's so cliche, but that is what it smells like to me.
That sort of buttery thing. Any other clues to the oak in terms of what you smell?
I definitely smell a lot of vanilla in this, and I think that's a huge indicator of oak,
A
especially.
very good indicator for oak. You're absolutely right. Vanilla and coconut are two big notes that we find in new oak, and that's what we're finding here is a Chardonnay that spent a lot of time in new oak. And I would compare that to the Jadot, the Burgundy, which they can spend a lot of time in new oak, but often you'll find this kind of style where there's a lot of used oak. So the oak is there, but it's not really so much an aromatic thing, as you saw. It's more about creating a textural component to the wine as well.
So the difference between using a new oak and an old oak is that it's not going to be as apparent in the wine when you use old oak.
I would say for the aromatics, for how it smells, definitely. Yeah, new oak can definitely bring those things. And it brings other notes as well. Pie spices show up a lot. Cinnamon, clove, cardamom, those sorts of things. That's not exclusive to oak, but often that'll be an influence for sure. Dill is another one, by the way, that we sometimes find from American oak, but that's not going on here, I don't think. Yeah, it can get a little weird with oak sometimes, and oak can be hard because sometimes the grape can fool you. So that textural element now, what do you think's going on there? We've talked a little bit, you talked about that buttery element. Where does that come from? Because we sort of got it here, but we got it so much more here.
I have no idea.
No idea. All right. So that buttery character, especially for something like Chardonnay, is not actually inherent in the grape. It's very much a winemaker's decision, and this is something that confuses so many people about Chardonnay, and even you said it. You say, when I think of Chardonnay, I think of this. It's buttery. It's oaky. But those are decisions that the winemaker gets to make, and we saw the contrast with this one where it was neither oaky nor buttery, but it was absolutely 100% Chardonnay. So that is where it gets so confusing, where we get this spectrum of Chardonnays. So if you're into that big, buttery, what we sometimes call the California style, although you will find it made in this style all over the world, to be honest, that contrast and that difference that you get with this big kind of oaky, sort of malolactic thing versus something that's been stainless steel and has no malolactic in it. What is malolactic?
It's the process of fermentation and
Keep going.
the way the sugars are converted and how long they're allowed to.
Close, very close. All right, malolactic, sometimes we call it fermentation, but it's really more of a pseudo-fermentation, or more properly, a conversion. And what's happening with malolactic conversion is the malic acid, which is one of the primary acids that we find in grapes and a lot of fruits, apples in particular, hence the name malic. It's very crisp, very almost tart acid, and we sort of saw that, how crisp and bright and lifted, and that acid really kind of comes at you and it's got cut. When we allow certain types of bacteria, in fact, lactic bacteria, converts that malic acid into a much softer lactic acid. That's the same acid that we find in milk and dairy, but it's not a dairy thing in this case. The bacteria are doing the job. So non-dairy, but still has that lactic acid in it. And that lactic acid is a much rounder, softer acidity. So a side note on malolactic, by the way, it can get confusing because you can get that really big buttery character, right?
Yeah.
But you can only get as much butter as you have malic acid to be converted into lactic acid. So when you get down the road and when you go through this whole spectrum, and we'll see this a little later with some other wines in some other episodes, where a wine can go through malolactic fermentation, but it's not really going to come off buttery. And a big part of that is that there just isn't that much malic acid to be converted into lactic acid.
Yeah.
So again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the point is that with Chardonnay in particular, it doesn't have to be buttery. It doesn't have to be oaky. Those are winemakers' decisions, and they have so much control over that. What's your favorite?
This is the classic chard, and I think the reason that's my favorite is I find you can find other types of white wine that have this fresh, limey, acidic flavor, but it's rare to find another white wine that can have the same buttery elements as Chardonnay, and I think that makes it unique.
And actually, I think you're right. I think by and large, these really buttery whites tend to be the Chardonnays, and as often as not, we don't see so much of that with other whites. All right, I've got at least one more question for you. Which one's the sweetest?
This is a trick question, isn't it?
Maybe.
I think that the middle, this one is the sweetest.
All right, okay. Good guess. In fact, they're probably all about the same.
Okay.
And where texture and especially the aromatics, and this is also important, can fool you into thinking that a wine is sweeter than it is. Oak in particular, you get those plush, almost sweet smelling vanilla. Sometimes the grapes can be very ripe and they can smell almost a little sugary. And that can trick your brain into thinking that the wine is actually going to be sweet, when in fact, I'm pretty sure pretty much most, if not all, the sugar in these wines has been fermented away. So that can catch you out, especially with the nose. You can smell that oak and you'll say, oh, this is going to be sweet, but maybe not. So be wary of that, especially when you're tasting these bigger, buttery, oakier Chardonnays. All right, I think that should just about do it. So here we are again with an unoaked stainless steel Chardonnay. And for the record, this Chardonnay is coming from Monterey, which is a relatively cool climate for wine grapes. And they do a good job of keeping that really crisp acidity in there. They haven't done that mallow thing and taken away that crispness. That's what they're going for, and that's the style. Burgundy here with the Jadot also tends to be fairly cool. They're really surprisingly far north if you look at a map of the world. But it's a bit warmer, a bit more of a continental climate, so the growing season is a bit warmer. The grapes can get a bit riper, a bit of a fatter flavor profile, and you saw that. And again, they used a little oak to kind of fatten that up and plump that up a little bit. The Maryvale here is Napa Chardonnay all the way. We are coming out of Carneros here, the classic area in California for Chardonnay, the one that's so famous. And this is the kind of style that we so strongly associate with that neck of the woods. So here we go. Coastal, continental, also coastal, but the winemaker has chosen to take that cool climate and make it into a bigger, fatter style. And that's the spectrum of Chardonnay.
And what are we going to be eating with all of these Chardonnays? You're bringing them home for dinner. What are we serving?
Well, we've got one more wine to talk about that we didn't taste. That is the classic seafood wine. And we'll set that right in the middle here. And that is Chablis. Chablis, widely known and historically known as the ultimate seafood wine, especially scallops and mussels. Another style that typically we find in that very clean, minimal oak, very crisp, very mineral, almost tart and lean style, and that makes it a dead match for so much seafood. As we work our way up from the Chablis, which, by the way, 100% Chardonnay and only Chardonnay in Chablis. Very important.
So Chablis again is regional.
Absolutely. And Chablis is technically considered part of Burgundy, but it's the northernmost part of Burgundy. So Chablis, we're in the north of Burgundy. The Macon or the Mâconnais, we're definitely getting down into the south of Burgundy. And that shows in the style. With the Chablis, much more crisp, much more tart for some people. Again, the Macon, a little fatter, a little rounder, a little softer style. When we get up to something like these big Maryvales and we get into these big oaky buttery styles, certainly body and weight plays a role with these wines. And as they get bigger, as they feel bigger, you can definitely get them up with bigger foods and weightier foods. And I'll tell you, you can go to a steakhouse, you can order a Chardonnay like this, and it'll work just fine with something like a steak, to be honest. But by and large, we know the whites, you're going to want to stop short of barbecue. Usually they're not going to stand up to something like that. But the key is how the wine feels, how light it is, how heavy it is. That's really the most important thing most of the time when you're pairing with food. All right, any other questions?
I think that answers it for today.
Outstanding. So folks, we really hope you've learned some good lessons here about Chardonnay, gotten interested in exploring the different styles of Chardonnay, and really the key factor here is don't assume that because you've had this Chardonnay that means you know all about all these Chardonnays. So get out there, explore Chardonnay, and find your gem. Big thanks to Ellie Miller and Republic National Distribution for bringing up these wines and the expertise for these wines. We can't thank you enough, Ellie, and we'll see you all real soon.
Thanks for flying with us today. Leave your questions in the comments and subscribe to us on YouTube.